I stared at VP Brian Thompson across his mahogany desk, my hands trembling as the words sank in. For 9 years, I ran the construction payroll system for 10,000 workers across 5 states. Now you're firing me because your MBA niece thinks she can handle the financial model on her own. I asked the VP. Yes, effective Friday, he said coldly, adjusting his expensive tie without meeting my eyes. I packed my tools slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch between us like a taut wire. You've got until Monday morning, then your crews don't get paid. Tell the union, I said, walking toward his door. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer that decades of expertise meant absolutely nothing against nepotism. My legs felt unsteady as I walked down the familiar hallway toward my office for what might be the last time. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the beige walls that had surrounded me for nearly a decade. Each step echoed my disbelief that everything I had built here could be dismantled so carelessly. I pushed open the door to my workspace and immediately noticed something wrong. My computer screen was still glowing, displaying login attempts from an unfamiliar user account. Someone had been accessing my systems while I sat in Brian's office getting terminated. My stomach dropped as I realized Jessica must have already been granted administrative privileges to my carefully constructed payroll databases. Patricia Williams appeared in my doorway, her usually cheerful expression replaced by concern. The accounting supervisor had worked alongside me for 6 years, and I could see the worry lines creasing her forehead. Candyce, I heard what happened. This is absolutely insane. Patricia stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Jessica has been meeting with the executives for 3 weeks now. She's been showing them these flashy PowerPoint presentations about streamlining what she calls outdated processes. I sank into my desk chair, trying to process this information. 3 weeks. They had been planning my replacement for 3 weeks without saying a single word to me. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. Patricia continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. She told them that artificial intelligence and automated algorithms could replace what she called your antiquated manual processes. She actually used the word antiquated Candyce. Robert Foster from IT knocked on my doorframe. Can I come in? His expression was grim and I nodded. Robert had always been straightforward with me, never sugarcoating technical problems or timeline challenges. Candyce. I need to tell you something. Jessica submitted a formal proposal to upper management, claiming she could reduce payroll costs by 15% while improving efficiency through what she called modern data analytics. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had started here at 28 years old, fresh out of college, with a degree in accounting and absolutely no real-world experience. The company had been much smaller then, operating in just 2 states with fewer than 3,000 employees. I had built our current payroll system from the ground up, learning every nuance of union contracts, multi-state labor laws, prevailing wage requirements, and the incredibly complex overtime calculations that varied by location and trade classification. Robert continued, pulling up a chair beside my desk. She convinced them that machine learning could handle all the variables you've been managing manually. Brian actually said in the meeting that your methods were too dependent on human knowledge, and therefore unreliable for modern business operations. I felt a flash of anger mixed with professional pride. Unreliable. Over 9 years, my payroll accuracy rate had never dropped below 99.5%. I had navigated changes to federal labor laws updates, to state prevailing wage schedules, modifications to union contracts, and countless other regulatory adjustments without a single major error. The system I had developed accounted for hundreds of different variables that affected worker compensation across 5 states and dozens of different trade classifications. Patricia leaned forward. Candyce, there's more. Yesterday, Thomas Bradley called me about some payroll irregularities his crew experienced during what he called Jessica's trial runs. His guys received incorrect overtime calculations, missing holiday pay, and wrong shift differentials last week. Thomas Bradley was a construction foreman with 23 years of experience, managing electrical crews across Ohio and Pennsylvania. He was known for being meticulous about worker compensation issues and had never hesitated to call me directly when questions arose. If Thomas was reporting problems, they were real and serious. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda Martinez in Human Resources asking me to stop by her office before I left the building. I gathered my personal items slowly, each photograph and small memento representing years of dedication to this company. The coffee mug my nephew had given me for Christmas 5 years ago. The small, succulent plant Patricia had brought me when I was recovering from pneumonia. The framed certificate of appreciation from Local 847 for my work resolving a complex overtime dispute. Linda's office felt different when I arrived. She had always been professional, but warm during our previous interactions. Now she seemed uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact as she shuffled papers on her desk. Candyce. I want you to know that this decision came from very high up. I had no input on the timing or reasoning. I sat down across from her desk. Linda, can you explain to me how someone with zero payroll experience is qualified to manage compensation for 10,000 workers across 5 different state regulatory environments? She sighed heavily. Jessica graduated 6 months ago with her MBA from Pacific Coast Business Institute. Her concentration was financial analytics and process optimization. She presented a very compelling case about leveraging technology to reduce manual oversight and administrative costs. Pacific Coast Business Institute. I had never heard of it, which struck me as odd since I made it my business to stay current with business education programs that might produce qualified candidates for our department. Linda must have noticed my puzzled expression because she added, "It's an online program, fully accredited, of course." The conversation ended awkwardly, with Linda expressing what seemed like genuine regret about the situation, but making it clear that the decision was final and non-negotiable. I walked back to my office, where Patricia and Robert were waiting with boxes to help me pack my personal belongings. As I powered down my computer one final time, I accidentally clicked on my email program, which opened to show recent messages. At the top of the inbox was an internal forwarded message thread between Brian Thompson and CEO David Morrison. The preview line made my blood run cold. Read Jessica's qualifications and family obligations. I clicked on the message before I could stop myself. and what I read confirmed my worst suspicions. The email chain revealed that Jessica had graduated from a mid-tier online MBA program just 6 months earlier and had zero actual payroll experience. More damaging was David Morrison's response, acknowledging that Brian had promised his sister, who happened to be Jessica's mother, that this position would help Jessica establish her career in corporate finance. The final email in the thread was the most revealing. Brian had written, "I understand the risk, David, but family pressure is intense right now. Jessica needs this opportunity to prove herself, and frankly, how complicated can payroll really be? The systems practically run themselves these days." I stared at the screen in complete disbelief. 9 years of expertise, institutional knowledge that couldn't be replicated or downloaded, and intimate understanding of regulatory complexities that took years to master, all dismissed with the phrase, "How complicated can payroll really be?" Patricia looked over my shoulder and read the emails. Her face flushed with anger. "Candyce, this is unbelievable. They're treating your job like it's some entry-level position they can hand to anyone with a business degree." I forwarded the email thread to my personal account and shut down the computer. The gravity of what was about to happen on Monday morning was becoming clearer. Jessica wasn't just unprepared for the technical challenges ahead. She was completely unaware that such challenges even existed. As I walked toward the elevator, carrying my box of personal items, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread. I had been right about the impossible nature of what they were attempting, but being right meant that 10,000 hardworking people were about to suffer the consequences of corporate arrogance and nepotism. My apartment felt unusually quiet on Monday morning. As I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, waiting for the inevitable, the silence was broken at 7:15 when my personal cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Willie Jackson, a crane operator I had worked with for 6 years. "Candyce, what the hell happened with payroll?" Willie's voice carried a mixture of confusion and frustration. My direct deposit was supposed to hit Friday night like always, but I got 17 cents. 17 cents. My rent is due today, and I've got 3 kids to feed. Before I could respond, my phone was buzzing with another incoming call from Sandra Lopez, an electrical foreman based in Texas. I put Willie on hold and answered Sandra's call. "Candyce, thank God you picked up. None of my crew got paid. Nothing. No direct deposits, no notification, no explanation. What's going on?" The floodgates opened after those first 2 calls. My phone didn't stop ringing for the next 4 hours as construction supervisors, crew leaders, and individual workers called from across all 5 states where the company operated. Each conversation revealed a different variation of the same catastrophic failure. Some workers received fractional payments like Willie's 17 cents. Others got nothing at all. A few received massive overpayments that would inevitably need to be clawed back, creating additional problems. Around 11:30, I received a call from Carlos Rodriguez, the union representative for Local 847. "Candyce, we've got a serious situation developing. I've been fielding calls since 6 this morning from workers who didn't get paid. This isn't just a technical glitch. This is a complete system failure." Carlos explained that union lawyers were already reviewing the situation for contract violations related to timely wage payment requirements. Under their collective bargaining agreement, the company faced escalating financial penalties for each day wages remained unpaid, starting at $50 per affected worker per day and doubling every subsequent day. My phone rang again, and I recognized the number as Jessica Thompson calling from the company's main office. I hesitated before answering, curious to hear how she was handling the crisis she had created. Candyce, Jessica's voice was tight with panic. I need your help. The payroll system isn't working properly, and I can't figure out what went wrong. The algorithms I designed should have handled all the calculations automatically, but something isn't processing correctly. I took a deep breath before responding. Jessica, what specific algorithms are you referring to? Can you walk me through your process? There was a long pause before she answered. Well, I created a master spreadsheet that pulls data from the time tracking system and applies standard overtime multipliers based on federal guidelines. But the outputs aren't matching what workers expect to receive. Standard overtime multipliers based on federal guidelines. Those 8 words revealed the depth of her misunderstanding about payroll complexity in the construction industry. Jessica had no comprehension that prevailing wage rates varied by county within each state, that union contracts specified different overtime thresholds for different trades, that some projects required double time after 10 hours, while others required it after 8, or that health care and pension contributions were calculated using completely different formulas depending on worker classification. Jessica, I said carefully, federal guidelines are just the baseline. Each state has its own prevailing wage requirements, and every union contract has specific overtime calculations that vary by trade classification. Your master spreadsheet can't possibly account for those variables without being programmed with hundreds of specific rules. But my MBA program taught me that modern data analytics can handle those kinds of calculations. Automatically, she replied, her voice becoming more strained. The professors said artificial intelligence makes manual oversight unnecessary. I spent 20 minutes trying to explain some of the basic complexities she had overlooked, but it became clear that Jessica didn't understand the fundamental difference between theoretical business concepts and practical implementation in a heavily regulated industry. She had built her algorithms based on simplified academic models that bore no resemblance to real-world payroll requirements. Shortly after I hung up with Jessica, my phone rang again. This time it was Brian Thompson, and his tone was completely different from Friday's cold dismissal. Candyce, I need you to come in today as a temporary consultant to help resolve some technical issues with the payroll transition. I'm no longer an employee, Brian. You terminated me on Friday, remember? This is an emergency situation, and we need someone with your institutional knowledge to get things back on track quickly. We can pay you consulting fees for your time. Brian, I warned you on Friday that Jessica wasn't ready to handle this system. You dismissed my concerns and proceeded anyway. Now 10,000 workers can't pay their bills because you prioritized family politics over operational competence. The conversation became increasingly tense as Brian tried various approaches to convince me to return temporarily. He alternated between appeals to my loyalty to coworkers' threats about potential legal consequences if I refused to help, and promises of generous compensation for consulting services. I declined his offers and ended the call. Within an hour, I received a visit from Sarah Henderson, an employment attorney who had gotten my contact information from one of the affected workers. Sarah explained that under federal and state labor laws, the company faced massive financial penalties for delayed wage payments, and that workers had grounds for class action lawsuits if the situation wasn't resolved quickly. That afternoon, I turned on the local news and was shocked to see our story leading the broadcast. Channel 9 News had interviewed several construction workers and their families about the impact of missing paychecks. The segment was titled "Construction Giant Fails to Pay Thousands of Workers" and featured emotional interviews with families who couldn't afford groceries or prescription medications because of the company's payroll failure. Tracy Adams, whose husband operated cranes for one of our bridge construction projects, appeared on camera holding her 8-year-old daughter. "My husband has worked for this company for 4 years without missing a day," she said, fighting back tears. "Now I can't afford my daughter's asthma inhaler because they decided to fire the one person who knew how to pay their workers correctly." The news segment included a brief interview with David Morrison, the company's CEO, who claimed they were working around the clock to resolve technical difficulties with their upgraded payroll system. He made no mention of Jessica's qualifications, the nepotism involved in my termination, or the warnings I had provided about the impossibility of the transition timeline. As I watched the broadcast, I realized this crisis had grown far beyond a simple payroll glitch. Thousands of working families were suffering real hardship because of corporate arrogance and nepotism. Children couldn't get medical care. Families faced eviction, and workers who had faithfully contributed to their communities for years were suddenly unable to meet basic financial obligations. My phone rang one more time that evening. It was Margaret Foster, a senior union representative who had coordinated multi-state labor actions in the past. "Candyce, we need to talk. What happened today isn't just a company problem anymore. This is shaping up to be the largest construction work stoppage in regional history, and we need your help understanding exactly what went wrong and how long it might take to fix it." Tuesday morning brought news that transformed our local crisis into a regional catastrophe. I woke up to find my phone filled with voicemail messages from union representatives across all 5 states where the company operated construction projects. The coordinated work stoppage that Margaret Foster had mentioned was already underway. By 8 o'clock, construction projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars had ground to complete halts. Interstate highway repairs in Ohio sat abandoned with orange barrels marking empty work zones. A new children's hospital in Texas had scaffolding surrounding a partially completed structure, with no workers in sight. School renovation projects in Pennsylvania faced indefinite delays just weeks before the start of the academic year. Commercial developments in Georgia and North Carolina remained eerily quiet, with expensive heavy equipment sitting motionless under the morning sun. Margaret Foster called me at 9:15 with an update that made the scope of the situation clear. "Candyce, we've got crews from Local 847, Local 294, Local 612, and Local 903 all refusing to work until they receive guaranteed payment for last week plus assurance about future paychecks. That's over 8,000 union members across 5 states. The math was staggering. 8,000 workers earning an average of $35 per hour meant the company was losing approximately $280,000 in productivity for every hour the work stoppage continued. More significantly, contractual penalties for project delays would quickly escalate into the millions of dollars. Around 10 o'clock, I received an unexpected call from Michael Roberts, an investigative journalist for Regional Business Weekly. Michael explained that he had been tracking patterns of corporate governance issues in the construction industry and wanted to understand the connection between my termination and the subsequent payroll crisis. Candyce, I've been researching your company's executive compensation and board composition for an article I'm working on. Your situation fits a pattern I have been documenting about family nepotism and financial mismanagement in publicly traded construction firms. Michael shared preliminary research showing that CEO David Morrison CFU, Andrew Parker, and VP Brian Thompson had collectively received bonuses totaling $4.7 million in the previous fiscal year while simultaneously implementing cost reduction initiatives that eliminated experienced middle management positions. My termination appeared to be part of a broader strategy to reduce operational costs by replacing seasoned employees with cheaper, less qualified alternatives. The conversation took an interesting turn when Michael mentioned that Jessica's hiring was just one example of family members being placed in critical positions despite questionable qualifications. Brian Thompson's son-in-law had recently been appointed as head of safety compliance, despite having no background in construction safety regulations. The CFO's nephew was now managing equipment procurement with authority over multi-million-dollar purchase decisions. During lunch, I received a call from Linda Martinez in Human Resources. Her tone was apologetic but urgent. Candyce, I need to ask if you would consider returning to work immediately under a special consulting arrangement. The board of directors met this morning and authorized me to offer you a substantial salary increase and a promotion to Senior Vice President of Operations if you can help us resolve the current situation. Linda, yesterday, Brian threatened me with legal action when I refused to come back as a temporary consultant. Today, you're offering me a promotion. What changed? She sighed heavily. The work stoppages, the media coverage, and the legal complications have the board extremely concerned. Stock prices dropped 12% yesterday, and our bonding companies are threatening to cancel coverage on active projects if this situation isn't resolved within 72 hours. I declined the offer, explaining that returning to work wouldn't solve the fundamental problems created by Jessica's incompetent payroll management. The data corruption and system failures she had caused would require weeks of careful reconstruction to repair, assuming all the necessary backup information still existed. That afternoon brought a call from Tom Wilson, a federal mediator with the Department of Labor. Tom explained that his agency had received complaints from 5 different state labor commissioners about potential wage theft violations and was launching a formal investigation into the company's payroll practices. Candyce, we understand you were the senior payroll administrator prior to the current situation. Would you be willing to serve as a technical expert to help us understand the scope of regulatory violations that may have occurred? The federal investigation added a new dimension to the crisis. Willful violations of wage payment laws carried criminal penalties for corporate executives, particularly when thousands of workers were affected. The Department of Labor's involvement meant that even if the company somehow managed to restore payroll functionality, executives could still face personal legal consequences for the damage already done. My phone rang again around 4 o'clock. This time it was Jessica, and she was clearly in emotional distress. Candyce, I don't know what to do. My uncle is blaming me for everything, but I never claimed I could handle all these complications. The MBA program never covered union contracts or state-specific regulations. I just thought payroll was about calculating hours times wages. For the first time since this crisis began, I felt sympathy for Jessica rather than anger. She had been placed in an impossible situation by executives who should have known better. Her uncle had promised her a career opportunity without explaining the technical requirements or regulatory complexities involved. Jessica continued through tears. I've been working 18-hour days trying to fix the problems I created. But every time I solve one issue, 2 new ones appear. The workers hate me. The union representatives won't take my calls, and my family thinks I'm incompetent. I spent 30 minutes on the phone with Jessica explaining some basic concepts about construction payroll and helping her understand why her approach had failed so catastrophically. It became clear that she genuinely wanted to do the right thing, but lacked the foundational knowledge necessary to understand what the right thing actually entailed. Tuesday evening brought more sobering news coverage. National business networks had picked up the story as an example of corporate nepotism creating operational disasters. The coverage included interviews with construction workers from multiple states describing the impact on their families and communities. One particularly powerful segment featured an interview with Danny Rivera, a welder working on the hospital construction project in Texas. Danny explained that his wife was scheduled for cancer treatment that week, but they couldn't afford the co-payment because his paycheck hadn't been deposited. He was forced to ask family members for money to cover medical expenses for the first time in his 20-year career. The human cost of corporate incompetence was becoming impossible to ignore. These weren't abstract business metrics or theoretical management concepts. These were real families facing genuine hardship because executives had prioritized personal relationships over operational competence. I went to bed Tuesday night with a growing sense that this crisis was evolving into something much larger than a simple payroll error. The combination of work stoppages, media attention, federal investigations, and mounting financial penalties was creating pressure that would force fundamental changes in how the company operated. Wednesday morning brought a call that would shift my role from passive observer to active participant in the unfolding drama. Sarah Henderson, the employment attorney, called with news that multiple law firms were coordinating a comprehensive legal strategy targeting both wrongful termination claims and class action lawsuits on behalf of affected workers. Candyce, we believe this case could set important precedents about corporate accountability and worker protection. Your expertise and documentation would be crucial for proving that executive negligence directly caused the harm workers are experiencing. Are you willing to serve as a key witness in what might become landmark litigation? The decision felt weighty, but the choice was clear. Thousands of people were suffering because of decisions made by executives who prioritized personal interests over professional competence. If my knowledge and experience could help achieve justice for those workers and their families, I had an obligation to participate in that effort. Wednesday afternoon marked a turning point when Michael Roberts called with information that expanded the scope of our situation far beyond a simple nepotism scandal. His investigative research had uncovered financial irregularities that suggested systematic corporate fraud spanning several years. Candyce, I need to share some documents with you confidentially. What I've discovered goes way beyond your termination and Jessica's hiring. There's evidence of a coordinated scheme to extract maximum value from the company before a planned sale to private equity investors. Michael arranged to meet me at a coffee shop near downtown, bringing a briefcase filled with financial records, SEC filings, and internal communications he had obtained through sources within the company. The documents painted a disturbing picture of deliberate mismanagement designed to inflate short-term profits while hiding long-term operational problems. The most damaging evidence showed that Brian Thompson, David Morrison, and Andrew Parker had been systematically replacing experienced employees with unqualified relatives while inflating executive compensation packages. My termination wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a calculated plan to eliminate high-salary employees before the company's sale, making the business appear more profitable to potential buyers. Michael spread several documents across our table. Look at this pattern, Candyce. Over the past 18 months, they've terminated 12 department heads with an average tenure of 8 years and replaced them with family members who have minimal relevant experience. The combined salary reduction from those changes was $2.4 million annually. The documentation showed that funds saved from employee terminations were being diverted into executive bonuses, consulting contracts with family-owned businesses, and what appeared to be personal expenses disguised as business development costs. Brian Thompson's sister received $600,000 for marketing consulting despite having no marketing experience. David Morrison's brother-in-law was paid $400,000 for legal services that were never actually provided. More troubling were emails between executives discussing their timeline for completing the private equity sale. The messages revealed that they planned to eliminate an additional 50 experienced employees before the transaction closed, further inflating apparent profitability while creating operational chaos that buyers wouldn't discover until after the purchase was completed. Michael pointed to a particularly damaging email exchange. This communication shows that they knew Jessica's appointment would likely cause payroll problems, but they calculated that any temporary disruptions would be resolved after the company's sale, making it the new owner's problem rather than theirs. The scope of financial manipulation was staggering. Beyond the nepotistic hiring practices, executives had been diverting funds meant for worker benefits, safety equipment upgrades, and infrastructure maintenance into personal compensation packages. Equipment that should have been replaced for safety reasons remained in service while executives extracted millions of dollars from operational budgets. I asked Michael how he had obtained such detailed internal information. He explained that several employees still working within the company had become whistleblowers, providing documentation because they were concerned about both worker welfare and their own job security under the planned ownership transition. That evening, I received a call from Detective Amanda Clark with the State Attorney General's Economic Crimes Unit. Detective Clark explained that multiple agencies were now investigating the company for securities fraud labor law violations and potential criminal conspiracy charges. Ms. Johnson, we understand you have intimate knowledge of the company's financial operations and access to documentation that might be relevant to our investigation. Would you be willing to cooperate as a witness in a criminal case? The criminal investigation added another layer of complexity to the situation. If prosecutors could prove that executives had deliberately misrepresented company finances to inflate stock prices while knowing their decisions would harm workers, the legal consequences could include substantial prison sentences for the individuals involved. Thursday morning brought more revelations when I attended a union meeting that had been called to coordinate the ongoing work stoppage. The meeting was held at a community center in Cleveland with representatives from locals across all 5 states, participating either in person or by video conference. Union attorney Jennifer Walsh presented evidence that the company had been systematically underfunding pension contributions and health insurance premiums while reporting those expenses as fully paid in their financial statements. The shortfall totaled nearly $8 million over 2 years, meaning that workers' retirement and healthcare benefits were significantly less secure than they had been led to believe. Margaret Foster addressed the crowd of union representatives and affected workers. This isn't just about missing paychecks anymore. This is about corporate executives stealing from working families while enriching themselves. We're not going back to work until there's accountability and guarantees about our benefits and future employment security. The meeting included emotional testimony from workers whose families had been affected by the payroll crisis. James Mitchell, a heavy equipment operator from Georgia, explained that his daughter's college tuition payment had bounced because his paycheck never arrived, potentially jeopardizing her enrollment for the fall semester. Susan Bailey, an electrician from Pennsylvania, described having to choose between buying groceries and filling her prescription for diabetes medication because the family budget depended on her regular paycheck. Her voice broke as she explained calling family members for financial help for the first time since she had started working in construction 15 years earlier. The human impact stories were devastating, but they served an important purpose by documenting the real-world consequences of executive negligence. Each testimony would become evidence in the mounting legal cases against the company and its leadership. Friday brought a development that surprised everyone involved in the situation. Jessica Thompson called me requesting a private meeting to discuss something she described as potentially explosive information about her uncle's business practices. We met at a small restaurant outside the city where Jessica appeared nervous and exhausted. She had clearly been under tremendous stress, with dark circles under her eyes, and an anxious demeanor that contrasted sharply with the confident young woman who had been promoted to my former position just a week earlier. Candyce, I need to tell you something about my MBA thesis and about conversations I overheard between my uncle and CEO Morrison. Jessica paused, clearly struggling with the decision to share what she knew. My thesis paper that my uncle praised so highly was almost entirely plagiarized from a 1987 academic study about manufacturing efficiency. I changed some words and updated the examples, but the core concepts and analysis weren't mine. The admission was stunning, but not entirely surprising, given Jessica's lack of understanding about basic payroll concepts. More importantly, Jessica revealed that Brian Thompson had known about the plagiarism before hiring her because she had told him about her academic struggles during family conversations. But there's something worse, Jessica continued. I overheard phone calls between my uncle and David Morrison where they discussed making me a scapegoat for problems they knew would happen. They planned to blame the payroll crisis on my inexperience and use that as justification for additional cost-cutting measures. Jessica explained that the executives had calculated that a temporary payroll disruption would actually serve their interests by providing justification for outsourcing payroll functions to a third-party vendor, eliminating additional employee positions and reducing operational costs before the company sale. The revelation that executives had knowingly created the crisis as part of their broader financial manipulation scheme transformed my understanding of the situation. This wasn't incompetence or nepotism gone wrong. This was deliberate sabotage of company operations to serve personal financial interests. Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. I recorded some of those phone conversations, Candyce. I know it probably wasn't legal, but I was scared about being blamed for things that weren't entirely my fault. The recordings would become crucial evidence in the criminal investigation that was already underway. Jessica's willingness to cooperate as a witness against her own uncle demonstrated the seriousness of the crimes that had been committed and the extent to which even family members were expendable in the executive's pursuit of personal profit. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how dramatically this situation had evolved since my termination the previous Friday. What had started as a simple case of nepotism and poor judgment had revealed itself to be systematic corporate fraud affecting thousands of workers and their families. The fight ahead would be challenging, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the cause was just. Saturday morning marked the beginning of my transformation from passive victim to strategic offensive leader. After a week of watching executives manipulate the situation, while workers suffered, I decided it was time to coordinate a comprehensive response that would achieve justice for everyone who had been harmed by corporate greed and incompetence. My first call was to Margaret Foster, the senior union representative who had been coordinating the multi-state work stoppage. Margaret, I want to propose something that might sound unusual, but I think we need to form a broader coalition that includes not just union leadership, but also the journalists investigating this story, the attorneys representing workers, and the government officials conducting criminal investigations. Margaret was immediately interested in the concept. She explained that traditional labor disputes typically involved negotiations between unions and company management, but our situation required a different approach. Because the company's leadership had demonstrated they were willing to commit crimes to achieve their financial objectives. We spent 2 hours on the phone Saturday morning developing what we called a comprehensive accountability strategy. The plan involved coordinating simultaneous pressure from multiple directions, continued work stoppages to maintain economic pressure, media investigations to expose the full scope of corporate corruption, legal proceedings to hold executives personally responsible, and political engagement to strengthen worker protection laws. Sunday morning brought a conference call with Michael Roberts, the investigative journalist, and Sarah Henderson, the employment attorney representing affected workers. I shared Jessica's recordings and the documentation Michael had gathered, creating a complete picture of the conspiracy that had led to our current crisis. Sarah explained that the evidence was strong enough to support both criminal charges against executives and civil lawsuits seeking damages for affected workers. The recordings Jessica had provided proved that executives had knowingly created the payroll crisis as part of their broader financial manipulation scheme. Michael added that his editors were planning a comprehensive exposé that would run in the upcoming Sunday edition of Regional Business Weekly. The article would detail the systematic corporate fraud, the impact on worker families, and the criminal investigation that was already underway. Monday morning began with me receiving an unexpected call from Congressman Robert Hayes, whose district included several of the construction projects affected by the work stoppage. Congressman Hayes explained that he had been following our situation through media coverage and wanted to understand whether federal legislation might be needed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Ms. Johnson, I understand you have extensive experience in construction payroll operations and intimate knowledge of the regulatory framework that should have prevented this situation. Would you be willing to testify before a House subcommittee about corporate accountability and worker protection issues? The opportunity to influence federal legislation was both exciting and daunting. I had never imagined that my expertise in construction payroll would become relevant to congressional policy making. But the scope of our crisis had clearly attracted attention from federal lawmakers concerned about worker welfare and corporate governance. Tuesday brought a development that shifted the power dynamic in our favor. Detective Amanda Clark called to inform me that the state attorney general's office had obtained search warrants for company offices in all 5 states where operations were conducted. The coordinated raids would occur Wednesday morning, and my technical expertise would be crucial for guiding investigators to the most important financial records. Ms. Johnson, we need someone who understands the company's data systems and knows where executives might have hidden evidence of their financial manipulation. Your cooperation would be essential for ensuring we recover all relevant documentation before it can be destroyed. I agreed to assist the investigation, understanding that my insider knowledge of company systems would help prosecutors build the strongest possible case against executives who had betrayed both their shareholders and their employees. Wednesday morning's raids were conducted with military precision. FBI agents and state investigators simultaneously searched executive offices, accounting departments, and IT facilities across all 5 states. I accompanied the Cleveland team using my administrative access codes to help agents locate encrypted files, backup servers, and archived communications that contained evidence of the fraud scheme. The most damaging discovery occurred in Brian Thompson's office, where investigators found a hidden safe containing printed copies of the incriminating email conversations. Financial records showing the diversion of worker benefit funds and contracts with the private equity investors that revealed the planned sale timeline. More significantly, forensic accountants discovered that executives had been moving money to offshore accounts in preparation for potential criminal charges. The pattern of transactions showed they had been planning to flee prosecution while leaving workers without access to pension funds or severance packages. Thursday brought the news I had been hoping for since this crisis began. Federal prosecutors announced the arrest of Brian Thompson, David Morrison, and Andrew Parker on charges, including conspiracy to commit securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and willful violation of labor laws. The criminal charges carried potential prison sentences of up to 20 years for each defendant. The arrests created immediate changes in company leadership. The board of directors appointed an interim management team with explicit instructions to restore payroll functionality, cooperate with ongoing investigations, and implement comprehensive corporate governance reforms. Friday morning, I received a call from interim CEO Nancy Phillips, who had been brought in from outside the company to oversee the transition. Ms. Phillips had an impressive background in corporate turnaround situations and had previously led successful recoveries from management scandals in other industries. Ms. Johnson, I want to begin by apologizing for the treatment you received and acknowledging that your termination was completely unjustified. I would like to offer you the position of Chief Operations Officer with full authority to rebuild our payroll systems and implement whatever changes you believe are necessary to prevent future problems. The offer was tempting, but I wanted to ensure that any return to the company would involve genuine authority to make necessary changes rather than serving as a convenient scapegoat for ongoing problems. Nancy Phillips assured me that the board was committed to comprehensive reform and that my decisions about operational matters would be supported unconditionally. I requested time to consider the offer, understanding that accepting the position would represent not just personal vindication, but an opportunity to build systems that would protect worker interests for years to come. The chance to transform the company from a symbol of corporate corruption into a model of ethical business practices was appealing. Saturday brought a call from Jessica, who wanted to update me about her cooperation with federal prosecutors and her plans for the future. She had provided extensive testimony about her uncle's criminal activities and was entering a witness protection program due to concerns about potential retaliation from other family members involved in the conspiracy. Candyce, I want you to know that testifying against my uncle was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the right thing. What he did to you and to all those workers was wrong, and I couldn't stand by and let him escape accountability for his crimes. Jessica's transformation from naive MBA graduate to courageous whistleblower had been remarkable to witness. Her willingness to risk family relationships in order to serve justice demonstrated genuine character growth and moral courage. Sunday evening, as I prepared for another week of legal proceedings, media interviews, and strategic planning, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that Friday afternoon termination meeting in Brian Thompson's office. What had begun as personal betrayal had evolved into a comprehensive fight for worker justice and corporate accountability. The week ahead would bring federal court testimony, congressional hearings, and final decisions about the company's offer to return as Chief Operations Officer. The opportunity to transform a corrupt organization into an ethical employer was both challenging and inspiring. Monday morning arrived with the weight of expectation as I prepared to testify in federal court against the executives who had destroyed thousands of lives for personal financial gain. The courthouse in downtown Cleveland was packed with media representatives, union members, and families of affected workers who wanted to witness justice being served. Federal prosecutor Rachel Martinez had prepared me extensively for my testimony, reviewing the technical details of payroll operations, the evidence of financial fraud, and the impact on worker families. The prosecution's strategy focused on proving that executives had deliberately created the crisis, while knowing it would cause severe hardship for employees and their dependents. As I walked through the courthouse hallway toward the witness room, I encountered Brian Thompson for the first time since our confrontation in his office 2 weeks earlier. He was accompanied by expensive defense attorneys and looked significantly older than I remembered, with stress lines around his eyes and a defeated posture that contrasted sharply with his previous arrogance. Brian stopped when he saw me approaching and made an unexpected decision that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. "Candyce, I need to talk to you privately for just a moment." His attorneys immediately tried to intervene, but Brian waved them away. What he said next, captured clearly by the recording device federal agents had provided me, would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's evidence. "Look, I know what we did was wrong, but you have to understand the pressure I was under from the family and from Morrison about the company sale. Firing you wasn't personal, it was just business. We needed to cut costs quickly, and your salary was an easy target. I never expected Jessica to screw things up so badly that it would become a criminal investigation." The admission was stunning in its casual acknowledgement of criminal intent. Brian had just confessed on tape that my termination was part of a deliberate financial manipulation scheme designed to inflate company value before the planned sale. His attorneys' faces went pale as they realized what had just occurred. When I took the witness stand an hour later, the courtroom was completely silent as I provided detailed testimony about 9 years of flawless payroll operations, the warnings I had given about Jessica's lack of qualifications, and the systematic fraud I had discovered through the investigation process. Prosecutor Martinez asked me to explain in layman's terms why Jessica's automated approach had failed so catastrophically. I spent 30 minutes walking the jury through the complexity of construction payroll, using specific examples to illustrate how variables like union overtime, rules prevailing wage rates, and multi-state tax requirements created a system that required extensive human expertise rather than simple algorithmic processing. The most powerful moment of my testimony came when Martinez asked me to describe the human impact of the payroll crisis. I shared stories I had heard from affected workers, including the mother who couldn't afford her child's asthma medication, the family facing eviction because their rent payment bounced, and the cancer patient whose treatment was delayed because medical co-payments couldn't be covered. During cross-examination, Brian's defense attorney attempted to portray my termination as a routine business decision, rather than part of a criminal conspiracy. The strategy backfired when I was able to reference Brian's hallway confession, which had been captured on the recording device. The defense attorney's face registered shock when I testified about Brian's admission that my firing was connected to the planned company sale and the pressure to reduce operational costs artificially. The recording was played for the jury, and Brian's casual acknowledgement of criminal intent sealed his fate. Tuesday's testimony focused on the financial evidence that Michael Roberts and federal investigators had gathered. Forensic accountant Dr. Patricia Chen walked the jury through the complex money movements that showed executives diverting worker benefit funds, inflating personal compensation, and hiding assets in offshore accounts. The most damaging evidence showed that executives had extracted $8.7 million from the company over 18 months while simultaneously eliminating experienced employees and reducing operational budgets for safety equipment and infrastructure maintenance. Wednesday brought testimony from Jessica, who appeared as a prosecution witness despite the personal cost of testifying against her uncle. Her emotional account of the pressure she had faced to accept a position she was unqualified for, combined with the recordings of Brian's criminal planning, provided compelling evidence of the conspiracy's scope. Jessica's transformation into a credible witness was remarkable. She had evolved from the overconfident MBA graduate who believed algorithms could replace human expertise into a thoughtful young woman who understood the real-world consequences of corporate arrogance and family manipulation. Thursday's proceedings included victim impact statements from workers and families who had suffered during the payroll crisis. The testimony was heartbreaking but necessary to help the jury understand that this wasn't a victimless financial crime, but a deliberate assault on working families who depended on their paychecks for basic survival needs. James Rodriguez, the crane operator whose daughter's college enrollment had been jeopardized by missing tuition payments, provided particularly powerful testimony about the stress his family had experienced. His wife had been forced to work double shifts at a local diner to cover emergency expenses, while their daughter had seriously considered dropping out of school due to financial uncertainty. Friday morning brought the moment everyone had been waiting for: the jury's verdict. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all charges against all 3 defendants. Brian Thompson, David Morrison, and Andrew Parker were each convicted of conspiracy, securities fraud wire, fraud, money laundering, and willful violation of labor laws. The courtroom erupted in applause from the gallery, filled with union members and worker families. For the first time since this crisis began, there was a sense that justice had been served, and that powerful people would face real consequences for their crimes. The sentencing phase would occur in 30 days, but federal guidelines suggested that each defendant faced between 15 and 20 years in federal prison. More importantly, asset forfeiture proceedings would recover millions of dollars that could be used to compensate affected workers and restore the pension and healthcare benefits that had been stolen. As I left the courthouse that afternoon, surrounded by media representatives seeking comments about the verdict, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction that the system had worked correctly. Corruption had been exposed, criminals had been held accountable, and working families would receive both justice and financial compensation for their suffering. The fight was essentially over, but the work of rebuilding the company and restoring trust between management and workers was just beginning. My decision about accepting the Chief Operations Officer position would determine whether this victory could be transformed into lasting positive change for everyone involved. That evening, as news networks broadcast coverage of the verdict across the country, I realized that our local crisis had become a national symbol of the importance of corporate accountability and worker protection. The precedent established by successful prosecution of executives would influence similar cases for years to come. 3 months after Brian Thompson coldly informed me that my 9 years of expertise meant nothing compared to his niece's MBA degree, I sat in the same conference room where this journey had begun, but now as Chief Operations Officer with authority to rebuild the company according to principles of integrity and worker welfare. The transformation had been remarkable to witness and even more satisfying to lead. Federal judges had sentenced Brian Thompson to 18 years in prison, David Morrison to 16 years, and Andrew Parker to 14 years, for their roles in the conspiracy that had stolen millions from workers while endangering thousands of families. The message was clear. Corporate executives who betray their employees will face serious personal consequences. Asset forfeiture proceedings had recovered $47 million from offshore accounts and hidden investments that the convicted executives had planned to use for their escape from prosecution. Every penny was being distributed to affected workers through a victim compensation fund that provided full payment. For delayed wages plus substantial penalty payments that averaged nearly $5,000 per worker, the families who had suffered during the payroll crisis received additional compensation through a special hardship fund. Tracy Adams, whose daughter's asthma medication had become unaffordable during the crisis, received $15,000 to cover medical expenses and educational costs. James Rodriguez, whose daughter's college enrollment had been jeopardized, received full tuition reimbursement, plus additional funds for educational expenses. But the financial recovery, while important, was only part of the story. The real victory was the comprehensive reform that had transformed the company from a symbol of corporate corruption into a model of ethical business practices that other companies were now studying and implementing. The new board of directors had implemented transparent hiring practices that required public posting of all positions, objective qualifications standards, and independent review of all employment decisions. Nepotistic hiring was now explicitly prohibited, with violations subject to immediate termination and potential criminal prosecution. Worker representation on the board of directors ensured that employee interests would have a permanent voice in company governance. Union representatives now participated in strategic planning, budget approval, and operational policy decisions that affected worker welfare and job security. The profit-sharing program I had designed distributed 25% of annual profits directly to employees based on length of service and performance metrics. Workers who had been excluded from previous bonus structures now received substantial annual payments that recognized their contributions to company success. Regular external audits by independent accounting firms provided ongoing oversight of financial operations, ensuring that executive compensation remained reasonable and that worker benefits were fully funded according to contractual obligations. The transparency requirements meant that employees could review executive pay packages and company financial performance through quarterly reports. Jessica Thompson had become an unexpected ally in the reform process. After completing her federal testimony, she had enrolled in a legitimate MBA program specializing in ethical business practices and labor relations. Her first-hand experience with corporate corruption had motivated her to become an advocate for competency-based hiring and transparent governance practices. Jessica now worked as a consultant, helping other companies implement ethical hiring practices and avoid the nepotistic mistakes that had destroyed her uncle's career. Her transformation from naive MBA graduate to principled business professional demonstrated that people can learn from their mistakes and contribute positively to systemic change. The legislative impact of our case had extended far beyond company reform. Congressional hearings had led to passage of federal legislation, strengthening worker protections against corporate fraud, requiring disclosure of nepotistic hiring in publicly traded companies, and increasing penalties for wage theft violations. The Corporate Accountability and Worker Protection Act included provisions I had helped draft during my congressional testimony. Companies that failed to pay wages on time now faced automatic penalties starting at $100 per worker per day, with escalating fines that made deliberate violations financially impossible, rather than merely expensive. Union membership had increased significantly across the construction industry as workers recognized the importance of organized protection against corporate exploitation. The crisis had demonstrated that individual employees, no matter how competent or dedicated, remained vulnerable to arbitrary decisions by executives who prioritized personal interests over operational excellence. The industry-wide changes extended beyond labor relations to include new professional standards for critical positions like payroll management. The Construction Industry Association now required certification programs for payroll administrators, ensuring that future hiring decisions would be based on demonstrated competence rather than family connections or educational credentials alone. My personal journey had evolved from betrayed employee to recognized expert on corporate governance and worker protection issues. Speaking engagements at universities, professional conferences, and congressional hearings had established me as a national voice for competency-based hiring and ethical business practices. The mentorship program I had established was training the next generation of construction industry professionals in complex payroll operations, ensuring that institutional knowledge would pass to qualified candidates, rather than being lost to cost-cutting measures or nepotistic appointments. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the restoration of trust between company management and workers. Construction crews who had walked off job sites in protest were now working with renewed confidence that their paychecks would arrive consistently and that their benefits were secure from executive manipulation. The culture change was evident in small daily interactions, as well as major policy decisions. Workers felt comfortable raising concerns about safety issues without fear of retaliation. Supervisors focused on operational excellence rather than political maneuvering. Management decisions were based on evidence and expertise, rather than family relationships or personal preferences. The children's hospital in Texas that had sat abandoned during the work stoppage was now nearing completion with additional safety features funded by recovered executive assets. The school renovation projects in Pennsylvania had been finished ahead of schedule with upgraded facilities that exceeded original specifications. Infrastructure projects across all 5 states were progressing efficiently under management that prioritized quality over cost-cutting. 6 months after my wrongful termination, I stood before a crowd of 2,000 construction workers at the annual union convention, reflecting on the lessons learned from our shared experience. The most important insight was that competence and integrity ultimately triumph over nepotism and corruption, but only when individuals possess courage to fight injustice despite personal risk. I had learned that expertise earned through dedication and hard work creates unshakable value that cannot be replaced by connections or credentials alone. 9 years of institutional knowledge, regulatory understanding, and practical experience had proved more valuable than executive authority. Family influence or academic theories about business optimization. The workers in that audience had learned equally important lessons about the power of collective action when individual voices are silenced by corporate arrogance. Their willingness to sacrifice immediate income for long-term justice had created changes that would protect future generations of workers from similar exploitation. The families who had suffered during the crisis had demonstrated remarkable resilience and solidarity, supporting each other through financial hardship while maintaining faith that justice would eventually prevail. Their children would grow up understanding that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary results when they stand together for shared principles. As I concluded my speech that evening, looking out at faces representing thousands of workers across 5 states who had transformed personal betrayal into systemic reform, I realized that the most profound lesson was about the responsibility that comes with expertise and institutional knowledge. When companies prioritize political considerations over operational competence, experienced professionals have an obligation to speak truth about the consequences, even when doing so requires personal sacrifice. Remaining silent about incompetence and corruption makes professionals complicit in the harm that inevitably follows. The construction industry was stronger because workers had refused to accept that their expertise meant less than family connections. Companies across the country were implementing better governance practices, because our case had demonstrated the financial and legal consequences of executive corruption. Future generations of workers would enjoy better protection because individuals had chosen courage over comfort when confronted with systematic injustice. The transformation from personal betrayal to national reform had occurred because people understood that individual struggles often reflect broader problems requiring collective solutions. Today, as I review payroll reports that consistently achieve 99.8% accuracy while serving 12,000 workers across 6 states under our expanded operations, I am reminded that the technical work remains as challenging and important as ever. But now it occurs within a framework of respect, transparency, and accountability that protects both workers and the expertise required to serve them well. The greatest satisfaction comes from knowing that no future employee will face the arbitrary termination I experienced, and that worker families will never again suffer from executive incompetence disguised as business optimization. The systems we built from the ruins of corporate corruption have created lasting protection for the people who build America's infrastructure with their hands, their skills, and their unwavering dedication to quality work. Have you ever experienced a situation where standing up for what's right required personal sacrifice, but ultimately led to positive change that benefited many people? I'd love to hear your stories about times when individual courage created broader improvements in your workplace or community. Please share your experiences in the comments below and let me know how this story resonated with your own professional challenges. Thank you for joining me on this journey from betrayal to justice. I hope this story inspires you to value expertise over politics and to stand up for competence when it's challenged by corruption. If you found this story meaningful, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about workplace justice, and share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding that individual courage can create extraordinary positive change. Remember that your expertise and dedication have value that cannot be replaced by connections or credentials alone. When you see injustice in your workplace or community, you have the power to make a difference. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by ordinary people who refuse to accept that wrong is stronger than right.